So, PK, how's your convention going so far?
Okay, it is not my official title, but I've been joking with people that my title this week is Senior Democratic Correspondent from the Republican National Convention.
You cannot escape the Democratic infighting right now.
I have not yet been on the floor of this actual convention. I've not seen the inside of the arena. I am writing about the Democrats in disarray back in Washington from here in Milwaukee.
Well, let's talk about that then. We'll take a break from the Republicans and go back to the Democrats.
Perfect.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post. I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're coming to you this week from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. But even as we're here, we can't help but keep an eye on what's happening with the Democrats, specifically their debate about whether to press forward with President Biden as their nominee. It's Thursday, July 18th. Joining me today is senior congressional correspondent and columnist here at the Post, Paul Kane. Hey, PK.
What's up, Aaron?
So I want to talk about how Biden's campaign is going right now. There seemed to be a moment, particularly after his NATO press conference last week and after the assassination attempt of former President Trump on Saturday, where the Democrats kind of toned it down and the fervor to get him out of the race died down for a little while. But now it seems to be picking right back up. On Wednesday, we also saw Biden test positive for COVID. His symptoms are reportedly mild at this point, and he's isolating in Delaware while he's resuming his duties. But it comes as the questions about his candidacy are growing louder again. What are the most recent things that you're seeing about this internal debate in the Democratic Party, and particularly in Congress?
Sure. I think the way to think of it wasn't that it died down. It wasn't that people agreed that he should stay on the ticket. It was more like they decided to hit the pause button on this effort. That Saturday afternoon, he did 2 calls, I believe both were by Zoom or some sort of video conferencing. And one was to the Progressive Caucus and the other was to the New Democrat coalition. There is some overlap between the two groups. The New Democrats are sort of kind of the sweet spot of Biden voters. They're suburban professional types, pretty pragmatic. We were getting updates, especially after that New Democratic call ended. A member actually was so upset with how the call went that this member took 8 minutes of video of it and sent it to me. And then within about 5 minutes, the shooting happened in Butler, PA. And so at that moment, I think most Democrats realized that this was a bigger event, and that made the RNC a bigger event. And so they hit pause. But things really started to shift back on Tuesday and continue to do so on Wednesday, where you just had some Democrats who realized that they needed to start agitating, that they needed to start getting this in place because this nomination could be set in stone very soon.
You mentioned the New Democrats Zoom with Biden. You know, people passing along information from these private calls seems to be proliferating. There's lots of leaking going on right now.
Yeah.
It's really ramped up in the middle part of the week. Very few Democrats have actually come out and said that Biden should step aside. You know, we just had Congressman Adam Schiff, a Senate candidate in California, with one of the biggest calls yet. But it's just around a dozen right now. We're seeing members and leaders like Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, the leaders of the House and the Senate for Democrats, warning Biden that his candidacy could imperil Democrats' chances in the 2024 election. But overall, the number of critics is still pretty limited. And I wonder, given your reporting and the people that you hear from, just how pervasive are these concerns actually?
It's hard to put a number on it, but probably more than half of the Democrats in the House and Senate would probably prefer a different nominee at the top of the ticket. That's based on conversations that we have on background, but there's a real fear of stepping out and saying that your party's president should stand down, especially if he doesn't stand down. And there's 2 parts to that. One is if he's not going to give up, if he's not going to let Harris or someone else replace him, why do this thing where you keep cutting him and announcing that you're going to demand that he gets off the ticket, and you're going to politically hurt him more? So that's what's happening with a lot of Senate Democrats, the way I'm told. The senators are looking at this in a broader, pragmatic fashion, and I guess that's what happens when you get a 6-year term. You think through those things. The House Democrats are much more reacting in a quicker fashion and looking for something speedier. And part of this also is that House Democrats, until a month ago, felt quite confident, not guaranteed, but pretty confident that they were going to get that net gain of at least 4 seats and get the House majority back. And now, ever since the June 27th debate, they've been feeling a bit like they're in free fall.
So we've talked about the official members of the Democratic Party, the office holders, the lawmakers who are dealing with this situation. Obviously, they are very important. But one thing we're also seeing is a lot of polling on how the Democratic base feels about this. I'm noting in particular an AP NORC poll on Wednesday that actually showed almost 2/3 of Democrats wanted Biden to drop out. I think it's important to note that this is more than any other poll. We've had a lot of surveys on this. It's generally closer to around half of the Democratic Party who says this. But this strikes me as something that's going to kind of cause the Democrats to freak out a little bit more. What do you think that this public perception impact has on where things go from here?
Look, they are hearing this from their own voters back home, whether it's half or 2/3 or a lot. They're hearing from a lot of their own Democratic voters that they're worried that he's not the right guy to beat Trump, or even if he could beat Trump, he's not the right guy to be president for another full term. And so they're reflecting that. The people who have the diciest thing to go through right now are those that are in swing districts. You know, you're in a really tight race where 1 or 2 points in either direction could be the difference between a 2-year term and helping your party win the majority, or losing, heading into retirement, and your party not getting the majority. So they're in a real tough situation, and some of them have stepped out and said he needs to be replaced. Yes, 2/3 of Democratic voters might want him gone, but that means 1/3 don't want him gone.
Yeah.
So those folks have a really tricky needle to thread here. I'm in a swing district. I need my base fully revved up. Do I want to come out and say Joe Biden should go? Oh boy, that's tough, because I know I've got 1/3 or 40% of them want him to stay. Are they going to be mad at me because I've called on him to leave? It's tough. And that all plays into why we are still only at whatever the exact number is, 22, 23, 24, 25, in terms of Democrats, when you're talking about, 213 in the House right now with 1 vacancy, another 51, you're talking about more than 260 congressional Democrats, and only a couple dozen have actually formally said this. So
1 in 10.
Yeah, and that's why you sort of have these fears of not wanting to anger your own base and hoping that people like Jared Huffman of the Progressive Caucus from the Bay Area has sort of taken a lead in this effort to try and push Biden aside. He's in a really safe district. It's the Bay Area. It's super liberal. So it's easier for him to do that. And I think a lot of these swing district Democrats want more of the Jared Huffmans of the world to sort of take the lead.
To do it for them, yeah.
Yeah.
You made a really interesting point about the idea that pushing Biden aside could alienate people who feel strongly about Biden. I think the conventional wisdom is often that, Biden won in 2020 because he was the alternative to Trump. He was the one that Democrats viewed as having the best chance of winning that race. And it wasn't really an affirmation of Joe Biden as a politician or as a person. Like, he was the alternative and he was capable and he was good enough. But I think when you get into these Democratic lawmakers, there is a real loyalty that exists there that maybe doesn't exist with the broader Democratic base. I also wanted to bring in some reporting that the Washington Post has done this week. We talk a lot about how Donald Trump's kind of looking for a more loyal team of people around him if he's elected to a second term, much more insular group of people that are not going to question him. But the Washington Post reported that there is kind of this bubble around President Biden where he may not be getting the full information about where the polls are, or he's getting some selective information. How big of an impact do you think that has on this whole process?
Yeah, we have worked through sort of different ends of this. Tyler Pager, our White House correspondent, has been talking to people in the sort of second and third orbit of circles around Biden. And Michael Shear's been talking to people at the DNC and the campaign, and I've been talking to people on the Hill. And yeah, they've been kind of left to wonder sometimes when they hear what Biden's saying, like, well, where did that come from? On that call that I got this 8-minute video clip of, at one point he's answering a question from Mark Veazey of the Dallas area, a Democrat from the Dallas area. And he cited 3 national polls that showed me up by 4 points, the 3 most recent national polls. When I told Tyler that, he said, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, no, Biden has led in certain polls, but no national poll shows him ahead by 4 points.
And Tyler actually went through and looked at all the different polls from all the different sites and could not find that poll. And he went to the White House campaign teams and said, "What polls is he referring to?" They did not give an answer as to what those polls were.
They wouldn't even say it was an internal poll or something like
Nope.
that.
They just shrugged.
Yep.
And so when people hear that, they've been left to wonder, like, what's going on and who is he talking to? And our reporting has shown that it is, the tightest of the circles now. Mike Donnellan, who has been with him in different fashions since at least the 1980s, in terms of both polling and making ads and sort of being the id of Joe Biden guy, the way David Axelrod was kind of the id of Barack Obama. Karl Rove was that for George W. That's been Mike Donnellan's role. He is very close to Biden, and they're still talking. Steve Ricchetti was his chief of staff as vice president. He is part of that innermost circle, and now there are real worries that he's only hearing from those two and from the family, from his wife, from his son Hunter. Are they giving him that AP poll that says 2/3 Democratic voters want him to leave? I don't know.
I think the question about what kind of information he's getting, whether he actually has a handle on where things stand, is a valid question. I do think it's worth emphasizing that we saw kind of a momentary drop in the polls after the debate, but the national polls have not shifted a whole lot. We've talked about this before, where if he was suddenly down 10 points, like, the decision would be clear. If there was no change, the decision would be clear. Instead, Democrats kind of find themselves in this purgatory where they were already probably behind in this race. They're now behind by probably a little bit more, but it's stable and it's competitive enough that even if you're accurately summarizing these polls, you can make a credible case that this race still hangs in the balance. We see Biden supporters on social media and otherwise pointing to the 538 forecast of this race, which still has Biden as the favorite to win. It is a forecast that, I should emphasize, focuses on not just the polls, but the fundamentals of the race. So other things are in this. But I think that kind of just totally reduces the urgency that exists here. Democrats have very valid reasons to be concerned about this race, but until you have kind of that ironclad thing to point to that says this is probably over, the impetus for pushing him out and for him getting out, because of course this is his decision, is just not there. When we come back, we're going to get into a little bit more about what happens next, and specifically a brewing fight in the party over an effort to nominate President Biden weeks before the Democratic National Convention in August. We'll be right back. Paul, I wanted to get into something that I'm fascinated by right now, and that is the question of when Democrats are actually going to nominate their candidate. The plan right now is that this will actually not take place at the Democratic National Convention in mid to late August. They're actually planning to do it earlier, citing a law that was on the books in Ohio that required them to do it by a certain date, 90 days before the election. But Ohio actually changed that law and basically seemingly gave Democrats birth to do this at the convention. Can you just tell me, what is going on here? Some Democrats who are skeptical of Biden are very concerned about what the Democratic National Committee is doing right now.
Sure. All right. So if you pull back and look at the before times, before the pandemic, for a couple hundred years, parties held these nominating conventions every 4 years. They pick a city and they come to it, like here in Milwaukee. And those party delegates cast their votes. And that is when you have a major party nominee, just as happened Monday night when the Republican delegates chose Donald Trump as their nominee. But then the pandemic hit. Rather than coming here to Milwaukee, the DNC was supposed to be in Milwaukee, they did a virtual convention and they did a virtual roll call of all the delegates. And
then they're like, let's do that again.
Well, originally, we thought we were done with that.
Yeah.
We thought, okay, that was a one-off thing. But then all of a sudden, as states have these mail voting has become such a widespread thing, they've started moving up their deadlines to get the ballots out to people. One of which is Ohio. And they originally said the deadline was August 7th for when you had to have your name on the ballot. Well, at that point, the DNC looked around and said, wait, our convention is supposed to start August 19th and finish up August 22nd. What's going to happen there? And there became some confusion over, oh my God, is he not going to be on the ballot in Ohio? Wait, what about other states? What are their deadlines? Some of them are also in late August. And what happens if there's lawsuits and judges and all of a sudden you're kicking things down the road and you might have some states where he's not even on the ballot? So that was the initial motivation here to redo the roll call. And they announced this in June before the debate. Before the debate, they had this announcement that was like, here's how it's going to unfold. We don't know the exact day, but it would be early August. And that's what they said. So you're looking at a 2-week window here, where if you want to push Joe Biden off the ballot and get someone to replace him, you really only have 2 weeks.
I think what really strikes me about this is that this has raised such suspicions, and you mentioned Jared Huffman. And I think the thing that Huffman and others are wondering is what is the purpose of this? There is no real justification for that. The Ohio law, as mentioned, has been changed. And so we saw a really interesting debate, I would call it, on Twitter, on X, on Tuesday between Jamie Harrison, the chairman of the DNC, and Nate Silver, a polling analyst who's popular on X, basically arguing about this point. Harrison was like, there's still a reason to do this. And it's not because the law hasn't been changed. It's because basically he's saying that Republicans can't be trusted to actually follow through on this. They could try to do something. This law doesn't actually go into effect until September 1st, and they could do something before then. It really strikes me as seemingly plausible argument from the DNC that they need to do this, but also it seems like a lot of people just regard this as a complete pretext to try and rush this and get this done before the fervor can grow enough to a point where Biden has to drop out.
You had on Tuesday 3 party elders who are all close to Biden, all former DNC chairs, Howard Dean, Terry McAuliffe, and Donna Brazile, sent a memo to 180 members of the DNC Rules Committee outlining some of these concerns and why they would want to do this and get this wrapped up by early August. And their rationale came down to there are other states that also have deadlines around August 24th, 25th, and they just fear that Republicans, and not necessarily the RNC, rogue conservative actors. The Heritage Foundation has people out there that are like floating ideas for lawsuits. And this letter that they sent basically is playing into Democratic fears of Republican judges right now. And, look what happened.
Next to the immunity decision in the Supreme Court, multiple other decisions.
And they essentially say in the letter, if you wait until late August, almost August 20th, 21st, you're inviting lawsuits, and those lawsuits are not going to go to esteemed federal judges and circuits or whatever. It's going to be local yokel Judge Paul Kane, who's never done anything in his life except like prosecute dog thieves, and that's what they're saying. Like, you want to put this in the hands of some local judges and the Jared Huffmans of the world. And these are all more of the newer House Democrats who were really amped up on this on Tuesday and Wednesday. Like, they think this is BS. They think they are being given a cover story that is really just a rationale, a Trojan horse, essentially. Oh my God, we have to do this or else nobody's going to be on the ballot for Democrats, when instead they're just trying to lock this down for Biden to be the one on the ballot.
Like, practically speaking, what does it mean to nominate him early? And is that the end of the road? We were talking about this a little bit in our morning meeting at the Washington Post, where it's not necessarily the end of the road. And maybe there's even some reasons why letting Biden be nominated and then passing the torch could be a potential plan of action.
Legal theories abound. And one of them is what to do with this war chest. There are really big mega donors who are upset, and they're not writing these six-figure checks right now to the super PACs, but he is still raising gobs of grassroots money and was sitting on something like $240 million at the end of June. And most folks believe that since the ticket has been Biden-Harris all along, that if she were the nominee, it would just transfer right into her hands.
Hand over the cash. Yep.
There are others that say that's really kind of not exactly clear that she could do that. If, in fact, they were both formally nominated together as a ticket, and then he would bowed out and she became the top of the ticket, that would be more clear-cut legally that she could inherit all of that money. Mm-hmm. If, in fact, somebody else took over and had to start from zero in terms of how much money they had, I think you would see an incredible grassroots outpouring for that nominee. And I don't think this would be a legitimate problem. In the modern history of presidential politics, I think there's only been one time where somebody on the ticket has come off after they've been formally nominated. Tom Eagleton in 1972, when it was revealed that he had undergone some mental health issues. He was fine, but it was a much different time back then.
Right.
And basically, the McGovern people said he had to come off the ticket. They removed him. The party apparatus was able to do it. And there were procedures in place for how to do that. Nowadays, it does get trickier because they start mail ballots.
Mail
go
balloting
out
is
early.
a big part of this, yeah.
Mail voting really only came into play in the last 4 years post-pandemic. And now you've got a huge chunk of people that vote by mail, and those ballots need to go out early. And if you start monkeying around with names and pulling names on the ballot, off the ballot, then it gets really dicey. It's very tricky.
And I think it's important to note that, we talked about a state like Ohio. Ohio is not really a battleground state in the presidential race. Like, if Biden is somehow winning Ohio, he is going to be reelected as president. Like, that's not a threshold state. It's not one of the preeminent swing states. It used to be. It's not anymore. But there are other races on the ballot. There's a hugely important Senate race. There's down ballot races. The presence of Biden on that ticket is important to those other races, and it matters. And so it's not as simple as like the state doesn't really matter.
That's a very important thing to note. I mean, even in, a really super conservative state like Idaho, the Democrats that are there want to vote for their presidential candidate. It's the biggest thing that they'll vote for every 4 years, and it's not going to tip the balance in the Electoral College, but there might be a city council race. There might be a county commissioner race where a Democrat can win because an extra 10% of people showed up because they wanted to vote for their presidential candidate, and they then voted for Mayor Aaron Blake down ballot. Or do you want to be a county commissioner, mayor?
No, thank you to all of the above.
Oh, okay.
I think that one of kind of the undersold aspects of this is the Democrats who are concerned about Biden right now. They're worried about the mental acuity. They're worried about his ability to serve as president. But a lot of it is concern about something more practical when it comes to the 2024 campaign. And that's the ability to actually drive a message against Trump. Biden spoke to the NAACP on Tuesday. And in advance of this speech, we got previews from the Washington Post and others that he was going to roll out this proposal to cap rent increases at 5%. Mm-hmm. When he got to that portion of his speech, he kind of like squinted at the teleprompter like he couldn't quite read what was on there, and he wound up saying $55 instead of 5%. This was a big talking point for the day, and it didn't come through in this speech even as it had been previewed and was a big subject of conversation. So that really just struck me as like kind of a case in point for how he's struggling to drive a message. Like if you can't summarize your big new proposal in a huge speech, not a press conference, not being asked questions, but a speech, like how are you going to, get through and the complicated arguments and the many things that you're trying to say about Donald Trump, which I think we're still not seeing in some of these media interviews and public appearances.
Look, he has been making mistakes like that for practically his entire presidency.
I think that's a really good point. Another thing that Biden is doing right now is debuting a Supreme Court reform plan. I think it's pretty safe to say both of these things are long shots from a legislative standpoint, but what do they tell you politically about what he's doing and what he's attempting to do?
It's important to realize that in a bizarre flip of the script from 4 years ago, 8 years ago, where Biden was always sort of seen as the moderate old white guy voice of the Democratic Party.
The institutionalist.
Yes. The progressive wing always had the most hesitation, most caution, fear. Oh, God, he's just going to try and cut a deal with Mitch McConnell because that's what he did when he was vice president. Right now, they are providing some of his most critical support, especially in the Black Caucus, but also in the Progressive Caucus. You've got people like Congresswoman Jayapal who are supportive. And Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, two of the leading progressives, have been very supportive. And this is partly why, because in the last 2 weeks, Biden has done things like saying, I'm going to call for Supreme Court reform. And that was something that he really, really resisted.
Yeah.
There were people that wanted to push for packing the court and adding, more than the 9 justices because of what happened under Trump, and Trump named 3 justices. And Biden pushed that all away. And so now, in this moment, he is appealing to that wing again with this idea of talking about term limits, talking about trying to push for a constitutional amendment that would do away with the Supreme Court's immunity ruling. These are things that, monkeying around with the court that he would never want to do. He was the Senate Judiciary Chairman from the late 80s through early 90s. And, he oversaw all these Supreme Court confirmations back then. He has been an institutionalist and doesn't really like messing around with institutions. But now at this moment, he's pushing this. And that's the significant thing. Who is it appealing to? These people that he needs to keep standing up for him in their corner.
I do kind of wonder, though, if this is kind of thin gruel for the rest of the Democratic Party. This is your big answer to, trying to prove that you're up to the task, is these proposals that probably aren't going to go anywhere, rather than demonstrating that you can drive a consistent message against your opponent in this race. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Aaron. Anytime.
Paul Kane is a senior congressional correspondent and columnist for the Washington Post, and I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter. It's a wild time in the 2024 campaign, and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow with big takeaways from the final day of the Republican National Convention, along with the latest on Biden's campaign, of course. In the meantime, if you want more original, deep analysis of campaign news, subscribe to my newsletter, also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes and at postreports.com. And if you don't already, make sure you're subscribing to the Campaign Moment podcast feed for more episodes just like this one. Find us wherever you're listening, and if you're enjoying the show, make sure to tell a friend who might like it as well, and give us a rating and a review. Today's episode was produced by Charla Freeland and Laura Benshoff. It was mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow. Bye for now.